We're very pleased to be joined from Canberra, Australia by Kristinn Hraffnson, who's the editor-in-chief of Wikileaks. Kristinn has just given a press conference to the National Press Club there, and we welcome him to CN Live. Welcome, Kristinn.
Well, thanks for having me.
Now, the last question you asked was actually a statement. The person who asked you said that the Australian Press Corps had turned around on Julian and now supporting him. I wanted to ask you if that's true, if that you've now been to the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. You were interviewed on Planet America, I believe. The Sydney Morning Herald on Tuesday had a huge piece about you. So in your interactions with the Australian media, have you seen that they indeed have turned around and are backing Julian Assange, for whatever their motive?
Well, I'm not sure if I have the overview of the entire press corps here, but it was heartening to at least meet so many who have understood now that the grave implications for press freedom that the case of Julian entails. And there was overall a great majority of those who I talked to and who expressed themselves who were supporting Julian to fight against his extradition to the US. So the understanding is growing, and the support of journalists is growing as well. And it's really heartening to see. This is something that has, of course, been brewing for some time, ever since the arrest this spring in April. There have been events where you have seen this manifested. In June, I traveled to Tunisia, where the International Federation of Journalists voted without any opposition on a very strong resolution condemning the extradition and the treatment of Julian. So slowly, gradually, we're gaining some weight here in this hard push.
You know, Dan Ellsberg once told me that he originally went to Congress with the Pentagon Papers thinking once they spoke out, it would get press coverage. And then he realized he had to go to the press first, that the Congress reads the press, and then they'll act, that the media actually has more power. So having said that, how important is it for the U.S. and the UK media to get behind this in order to put pressure on U.S. and British governments? There's an editorial here or there in The Guardian and the New York Times, probably not enough.
No, it's not enough just to have a few editorials. That would be, in essence, rather a bad excuse of not taking more bolder steps, because this should happen through tough questions. That is what they are supposed to do, the journalists, questioning authority. And in this case, it's of particular importance. So we need more coverage, critical coverage, not just scratching the surface or an occasional editorial, but an overall analysis of the situation and the implications there. I hope we see more of that. There have been obstacles, especially in the media environment in the UK and the US. Still, there is an indication that there is a turnaround. It's correct that you said there is very important that journalists in these countries are true to their role. I mean, they are of a sort gatekeepers, and they have a duty to report on such an important issue, and report it fairly, accuracy, and with critical questions of those in power, as they should in every case, but especially this case, because it touches the fundamentals of their existence and their job platform, basically.
And now that this 9-year-long preliminary investigation in Sweden has finally again, once more been dropped, hopefully forever, would that help in the media coverage, I think, in the U.S. in particular? They can't really use that smear anymore, can they?
Well, that smear has now been pushed aside. Of course, those who actually took some work into looking into the details of that situation knew the political essence of this entire process, which was very shameful. And I hope that Julian's lawyer in Stockholm will actually take actions against the Swedish prosecution for the mismanagement of this entire case, which has been extremely hurtful to Julian. But talking about media and historical precedents, I was the other day looking back to the Dreyfus affair. I don't know if I mentioned this on your program before, but over 100 years ago, of course, that was a symbolic case of travesty of justice that is still remembered, especially in France. And every school children has to read about it because it is such an essential learning from that travesty. Dreyfus, of course, sentenced to life imprisonment for betraying his country, sent to Devil's Island off the South African coast. But 10 years later, he was free. But it didn't look good for the first few years. He had no support. The entire press was against him. One commentator at the time said that the only regret that the Parisians had at the time that the death penalty had just recently been abolished, so they couldn't string him up and kill him. So the press was against him. The politicians were all against him. So he had no support among the general public. In essence, there was one individual, his brother, who started the fight. And one man actually was able to then garner support of a handful of intellectuals who then started campaigning, the people who actually understood the importance of this case. And here we are talking about a travesty of justice, including a lot of similarities, evidence being tampered with, people lying in court, etc., etc. But there was a turnaround, and of course we all know of the Jacques front page letter by Émile Zola, who did the trick, who pushed it even further. But he had to flee the country. He had to go into exile to London because of that front page report. So in the end, even though we thought he was lost, or they thought he was lost on Devil's Island, he was able to return. His honor was restored, and he went back to the military, got even a promotion. So even though things are bleak, these battles are fought by the individuals, often not on a broad range, but as small groups of dedicated individuals who are able to push and push until things break. And that there is a breakthrough. You can almost smell the breakthrough in that sense, that the understanding, you get more understanding and sympathy from the cab driver who is driving you on the street of London, or even here in Melbourne, or in the streets in Sydney, than by some members of the media in London, for example. Not talking about leaving out, of course, the politicians. So I'm hoping this will be one with the understanding of the grassroots of individuals, and the support we are getting, and fights we are seeing being fought by people all over the world is really heartening and is having an effect.
Well, that's a very optimistic view. Welcome that. You're now going to leave. Your next stop on your trip in Canberra is over in the Parliament. Now, there was a group of about 10 parliamentarians who joined a group. Now, I understand that the discussion has been formally shut down about Julian in Parliament. Who are you expecting to meet, and what is your message going to be when you go over to the Parliament building?
Well, I will message a few parliamentarians there, and my message is basically this, that they will have to campaign on the inside to broaden the support across parties, and to push on the government to use all its ways and means to consular assistance and diplomatic avenues, and fight to, of course, in the short run, to alleviate the situation he is under, because Julian has to get out of that horrible prison, and secondly, of course, to fight for this case to be thrown out, because it's political persecution. It's everybody who takes a good look at it sees this is nothing to do with the law. It's not going to be fought on the merits of the law. If that was the case, I wouldn't worry, because the best lawyers are on the case. It should be easily won. But it's a politicized procedure. It's a political persecution. And of course, Julian Assange is a political prisoner.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, is not someone who seems very open-minded on this issue and many others. But in the UK, there is a general election in now 10 days. And I wonder whether you have any hope that a new government could come in and reverse the situation and drop the extradition proceeding.
Well, of course, it's obvious from, if you reflect on the statements made by Jeremy Corbyn and his shadow Home Secretary in the Labour Party, who are against the extradition to the US, that if they would be in a seat of power after the election, we would be more optimistic about the outcome of this case and about it being dismissed. But you cannot count on that. You cannot even count on politicians to act on the words they gave previously before the election. I'm reminded often by the fact that Barack Obama, and I have the quote, I think it's even on YouTube, who was campaigning in 2008 before his first term on the platform of protecting whistleblowers, and he was praising whistleblowers in speeches on the campaign trail. And look where he ended. He ended up with the having on his resume to being the president who was basically waged a war against whistleblower with the despicable tool of the Espionage Act. So
that's right. He prosecuted more whistleblowers than any other president.
Combined.
Combined, that's right. Well, even with Julian Assange in Belmarsh, WikiLeaks continues to do its work, and that was a major release on the OPCW, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the emails that you leaked. And that's congratulations to you, Kristinn, on that. The evidence fabricated by the OPCW, or at least suppressed by the contradicting evidence, led to the deaths of at least 8 civilians, if I'm correct, in that missile attack. In other words, the U.S., Britain, and France went on a military action, a missile strike against Syria based on falsified evidence. In 2003, we all saw how fabricated evidence led to a massive invasion of Iraq and the killing of hundreds of thousands of people. Of course, WikiLeaks did not exist in 2003. Had WikiLeaks existed in 2002, could you have perhaps been in a position to receive information from an insider that could have perhaps led to the stalling or the stopping of that war? Now, in that case, there was a buildup. There were several months before. We knew this could happen and it would happen. In the Syria missile case, the airstrikes took place almost days after, so there wasn't maybe enough time. But even after the fact, you've now revealed there was fabricated evidence. Is this a role WikiLeaks could have played, and one that it could play in the future to help prevent a major war?
I mean, it's always a possibility that can happen. And one would hope so, that platforms such as WikiLeaks could get information and publish it and stop aggression of this nature and horror to occur. You mentioned the Duma incident, which is, at that time, and I was reflecting back on that the other day when we did this release, that of course the missile attacks by the UK, the US, and France into Syria were conducted before the inspectors from the OPCW actually entered on the area, before the inspection started. But there was a claim of absolute certainty by Theresa May in the Parliament, by Macron in France, that the intelligence they had was bulletproof. Now, another thing actually then is turning, starting to be the case, and at least I'm not going to be judged on that particular event. The only thing that I am absolutely certain now, that we have not gotten the real truth about what happened in Duma. And by publishing his email was not saying that we now knew the truth about Duma. Maybe we will all never know the full truth about what happened that April day in Duma last year. But what is extremely important for us to know the truth about the OPCW. We need to expose the organization of what is going on in there. So at least we might know what did not happen for sure. So we need to keep the organizations to account. We rely on them. We of course know that they have been politicized before. I mean, the Intercept, when John Bolton was made the National Security Advisor, the former director of the OPCW came out in an interview on the Intercept, Joseph Bustani, and told the story of when in 2002, John Bolton, then an Assistant Secretary of State, basically threatened him with mafia tactics.
Threaten his children.
Yeah, he flew over to The Hague, according to Bustani, and said, "We know where your children live," which is, this is like a scene from The Sopranos or The Godfathers. This is absurd. So, and then, of course, because he resisted, months later, the U.S. government garnered enough support by member states to actually throw him out. So we know that there is an attack on organizations like that. The integrity of the organization are compromised, but still we are, even knowing that history, relying on them for our interpretation of what has gone on. And we, at least now, the time is shorter for us to get to the truths. I mean, this happened last year. Now we know that we don't have the whole truth, and we need the truth. We need to flush out all the information that was gathered by the fact-finding mission on the ground in Duma. And actually, there needs to be a transparent and in-depth investigation of what happened inside the organization. Then we'll know more about the documents that were and evidence that were gathered there, and we'll be closer to the truth. But of course, I would like, and the best thing would be that we would get information of this sort before they lead to deaths and destruction and missile attacks, etc. Maybe one day we will reach that point, and certainly that would be of great positive development for everybody.
Even if WikiLeaks had existed in 2003 and you had information that you put out showing that this was a complete lie, one wonders whether the mainstream media would have published it, because they were complete cheerleaders for that invasion. It was actually a very despicable display of the media then. And the same thing has pretty much happened now. You've come out with this email. There's been other revelations about this OPCW story, and there's almost nothing in the big mainstream newspapers and the big television networks.
Well, that is true. It is of grave concern that this is overlooked. And you're right. It was not just the leaked email that were published by WikiLeaks the other day. Last spring, a engineering report by one of the fact-finding mission members who went on the site was leaked after the final report was published by the OPCW, which totally contradicts the finding of the organization. That was mostly or broadly overlooked. I think only one journalist in the UK, sort of in the mainstream media, Robert Fisk at The Independent, was somebody who actually sort of directed the attention to that document and said, can it be? I mean, this has to be explained. We have to know the truth about this incident. And yet, so how much is needed? Well, let's see. I mean, there are a lot of brave people who are willing to take risk to get documents out if they feel that the integrity of their scientific base has been compromised or abused. Their conscience is bothering them. They want people want the truth. I mean, that is the essence of our nature, and there is enough people of courage to take the risk to get information out.
What you're talking about are two major and central institutions that defend democracy in the U.S. and globally, and one being the media, and the other being United Nations or the OPCW, an affiliated agency to the UN. I worked at the UN headquarters for 25 years. I knew countless UN officials. They were serious about being independent, many of them. There always was pressure from the US, from Britain, to do things to what the US wanted, and too often the US won. This is another example, and we see how even Nils Melzer, a special rapporteur for the United Nations, is being totally ignored by the United Kingdom in his letters to them, and they're supposed to respond to him. They signed up for this when they signed the treaties that made his job possible. And also the media. The media, again, does not cover this story, and they would probably not have tried to shut out any dissenting voices in 2003 again. But of course, that can't stop your work, Kristinn, and really thank you for that.
Thank you. My first job that I got in broadcasting journalism was in '91, and it was just after the start of the Gulf War. And I remember vividly how things were played there. I was astonished to see the theater of it all in the broadcast media, how it was almost like a staged event in the desert in Kuwait, and journalists were invited there to a play, to play a play of falsehoods, and they all sort of took it in. I remember all the rhetoric at the time. We were talking about smart bombs, like they were clever. And of course, the media was mostly kept out of the bloodshed and the misery. We just saw images of flying missiles. We were being told were very smart bombs who actually just took out infrastructure. Like, people were unaffected, and it was shocking. And I was dismayed at that time that we were so easily manipulated. And it seems to happen again and again, despite the fact that after some reflections after 2003, most of the media acknowledged that they had been played. But why does it happen then again and again? Why are they so gullible again and again? It's astonishing. But a lot is needed to change that, I'm sure.
You're absolutely wise to bring up that 1991 first Gulf War. That's what put 11-year-old CNN on the map. It made it a worldwide phenomenon because they televised those bombings, and that changed the coverage of war. And George H.W. Bush, who was the president then, came out and said that in a speech right afterward that the Vietnam syndrome is over. What he meant was that the U.S. could now attack again a country in a major operation, that they couldn't because of the opposition to the Vietnam War and how disastrous it ended for the U.S., but also how the media covered the Vietnam War. Every person at dinner time in the U.S. at the time, and I was a young boy, but I remember watching American soldiers bleeding as they were being put into helicopters and flown out of the jungles of Vietnam. And these many people on the right and the military blamed the media for losing the war, which is an absurdity, of course. But so they were determined that that wouldn't happen again, and they embedded journalists in that 1991 Gulf War, and then they started CNN's live coverage, and it got even worse in 2003. We're up against quite a lot, Kristin, but nobody could thank WikiLeaks enough for continuing to do the work that Julian started. I appreciate you taking your time out to speak with us today.
Well, thanks for having me on the show.